This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we're talking about cognitive biases in strategy and execution. Biases is a very interesting topic and one that we take very seriously in the life science manufacturing industry, as it can impact the quality of the product and add undue risk in this highly regulated environment. Interestingly, many do not consider their personal biases and the impacts on our decision-making and general ways of thinking. So today, I'm interested in digging deeper into acceptance that biases do exist, and that get some strategies for managing and moving beyond biased decision-making practices with our guest, Alex Castro. So welcome, Alex. So great to have you with us today.
It is truly my pleasure. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
You've done so much research and writing in this area, so we are super excited to dive in with you. And Alex, I know we chatted just before we started this talk about our listeners, but we have a lot of listeners across the life science sector, and the decisions that they make every day can not only affect their business, but also their end users as well as the patients. So can you share with us why removing cognitive bias from decision-making is so important for leaders today?
Well, I think that your audience can really relate to the fact that many times they are the recipient of downstream action, right? So a decision has been made somewhere up the food chain, in essence. And as a result, they're getting outputs that then they're many times, probably between 50 to 70% of the time, they're looking at these outputs and they're saying, why was this not thought out? Why are we surprised about this? Where is this coming from? Why didn't anybody plan for this? Why am I dealing with this and having to be the bearer of bad news and the validation side of going back and saying, this is not right? Right? Or we are not ready to do this or whatever. And that comes a lot from cognitive bias in the decision-making process. And that cognitive bias is really embedded in the process of saying, you know, my gut is telling me this, my experience is telling me this. And whenever you hear that phrase, even if we use it, because I know I use it every once in a while too, is the reality that we are applying a bias and trying to shape an outcome or a direction that we believe or want to happen. And that's not necessarily the right outcome. You know, for those in manufacturing that are listening to this, you know, it's that Six Sigma lean modeling, you know, root cause analysis of why is this happening, right? And, you know, cognitive bias is, you know, very much falls into that space, is that we are applying some preference, some personal agenda into the decision process that then downstream begins to affect a lot of people. And unfortunately, really minimizes potential and opportunity. And so I'm sure your listener is there. How many times have you been in a situation where you see the potential of something and the opportunity that you're excited about and being part of that team, only to recognize it's like, this is just not going in the right direction and we're missing our window.
Right.
And that's by stripping out the bias, that's what you can begin to rectify.
Yeah. And I mean, to that point too, I think sometimes because in the compliance world, we're so focused on regulatory expectations and meeting the compliance guidelines or guidances or directives of the regulatory agencies that we're afraid to make mistakes. And we look at everything as any potential mistakes or even bias to this conversation as a negative thing. And I think that doesn't disservice to us as an industry, because bias isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just our beliefs going into something, which may differ from somebody else's beliefs, right? And it's in recognizing those biases and actively working to be active beyond them. That I mean, would you agree that you actually can then manage the outcomes much more efficiently and effectively?
For sure. And, I think that there's many, I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit because there's a lot of content in everything you just said, I mean, it's really well articulated in that context is that, the listener right now is a highly trained, educated individual, right? And so their role is really in the compliance space or ensuring that there is a lot of regulatory considerations going on and validation in that process. But there are also professionals that have, aspirations and ambitions in as much for their company, the projects that they work on, and you want to see them successful. It's not as if this group of people, the listener right now is there to, be this, chair in the road to get in the way of getting there. That's not their role.
Right.
They want to see it as, successful as anybody else. And it's so frustrating to be in that role, to see something come down to the point where you finally get to interact with it, an opportunity, an idea, and only to realize that from its inception, it has been misdirected or has been misguided out the gate.
Right.
And that can be so utterly defeating as a professional.
Absolutely.
And so what they want to be able to see is they want to be able to see that at that inception point, that the decisions considered all of the true capability factors, that the articulation of the need was spot on, that the data collection that needed to happen was done in a way that was effective and be able to present the content that they need. And a lot of those things are so entrenched in what I call 1990s, 1980s thinking, and they just haven't advanced, right? Because we've seen the innovation engine as an example within all industries, right? Remember 10 years ago, I was like, you've got to get, every employee has to innovate. Every employee has to be participating in da-da-da-da. Well, that engine is working really, really well, right? There's a lot of great ideas, not only in terms of product development or opportunity development, but how do I do better validation? How do I do better process management? How do I affect the process in a more effective way? The gap that hasn't been addressed is the execution process, right? How do I actually get from idea to outcome? And that's where the chaos continues to defeat potential, opportunity, and people.
Absolutely. So, and I totally agree with that. And because you're talking about, this is where we were, 80s, 90s, this is where we are, and that there are gaps. But we have seen, I think, across all industries, not just the life sciences, that people are starting to pay more attention to, I want to say, like, more active thinking, right? There's the importance of more active thinking and getting your teams involved, to your point. So what in particular, in your opinion, has changed in terms of pace and impact that we're now seeing, that we need to enhance leaders and organizational decision-making practices? And it seems like we're moving in a much faster pace toward that.
Yes.
So, what's the contributing factors to that, do you think?
Well, I'll give you a case example, and that may help, but also that has also affected a condition. So, as an example, our company developed the initial COVID vaccine distribution system for California. We began the development of that system and that process back in August of 2020, before any vaccine had been approved, articulated in terms of the need, right? I mean, we had people meeting with teams across the nation around how do you order a vaccine to be distributed to a specific area. How's it going to get there? And what are the requirements? And you didn't even know what the vaccine, the refrigeration part was a guess at that time. Right. It wasn't even a reality, it was a speculative element. And where we found that there was a lot of this clash of recurring bias-based thinking was that the way to distribute this life-saving opportunity was in direct conflict to pre-COVID, pre-2020 thinking, because the pace of it was immediate, right? We were developing a distribution model and a method for people to order vaccine before the vaccines were even articulated within any context outside of the manufacturers and the researchers who were producing it, right? Including by many accounts, there are people who are listening to this who were involved in that process, right?
Absolutely.
And so, what we found is that there had to be this stripping out of this bias process in order to get to the root of what is it that we need to accomplish within that context. And more importantly, what happened, to your point, is that there was no second chance. There was no retrench. There was no going back and saying, oh, well, if that didn't work, then we're going to do this. Because imagine you have national leaders, right? You had political folks, from the president to the legislature, to governors, to legislators within states, to public health people, to private sector entities and health groups who were articulating it is coming, it's going to be here, and da-da-da-da. And there was enough consternation around the core vaccine itself, right? And who was going to produce it and how is it going to produce, and all the safety concerns. You could not fail to actually deliver the vial to the facility because the individual is sitting in a chair waiting to be vaccinated.
Right.
And so we had to work with, a lot of bias on the front end, and actually kind of ground everybody in the process and saying, 90%, 80% of what you're talking to today is pre-COVID thinking, number one. That no longer applies. And I think that that's one of the things that's the most difficult right now for many companies to really lean into, because it's very, very uncomfortable. Is that everything you knew prior to 2020 is largely ineffective now. And you have to reinvent it. And then how do you marry that to mandated protocols that have to be followed, that were developed not just pre-2020, but pre-2000 in some cases? And how do you take people who have been working in a rhythm of this regulatory process and adapt them into a newer model where everything is hyper accelerated? And it's hyper accelerated because we, as constituents or as customers, ourselves personally, we have our work persona where we show up and say, hey, look, we have to follow this process and da 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 da. We turn around, we go home, and there is an immediate need in our own life for something. It could be an app, or it could be some kind of a medical procedure, some kind of a chemical or a device that comes to us, right? Ironically enough, we have like zero tolerance for having to wait for that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
I agree.
So we are our own worst enemies in many contexts, right? And so, the challenge is, how do you break the cycle? And you break the cycle by upfront really understanding and measuring, not guessing, not assessing, not going through a human-based assessment, but really a machine-driven assessment that says, where are the vulnerabilities or the misalignment between capability and idea? And then are we able to articulate how to correct that? And then further, are we able to articulate what we need in a way that's measurable, so that the entire process is accelerated, and linking all of those steps together so you have a deeper level of acceleration from idea to outcome without sacrificing quality, without sacrificing validation, without sacrificing the necessary steps to protect people from certain outcomes, right? And
I think sticking with that concept a little bit, our sector spends a lot of time talking about right first time. I mean, we got to get it right the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly to your point about the vaccines, right? We don't have time to make mistakes. And not only do we not have time to make mistakes, it's patient safety, it's patient lives at stake if we make mistakes. So getting it right the first time is a principle that we live by in this industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we still see decision makers accepting failure or, the cost of poor quality, let's call it, as the cost of doing business. And how do you get beyond that, like accepting, because to me, that's got to be your cognitive biases. Like, we've always done it this way. There's always been a certain level of risk. We've always, had certain outcomes that maybe we had to do a recall or we had to rethink and retool. And as an industry and as regulatory agencies, we're expecting that doesn't happen.
Right.
But yet we as maybe the department within the organization is still going, well, we've always done it this way. And it's just the cost of doing business. Like, how do you get your entire team like beyond that thought?
Well, I think, for the listener, this is going to be the hardest thing to hear, is that it's not their fault. I mean, meaning that there's they've
been set up to fail, basically. Like,
they've been set up to fail.
The processes aren't right. The procedures aren't right. The management's not right, whatever. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, it's, we had a client who was in the health insurance space. And as they were modifying things to provide better policy coverages and things like that, we had a defect rate within that client that was astronomical. They were reworking certain parts of their development cycle like 12 times. Mm-hmm. And it was insane. And they just refused to change. And then suddenly, 2020 hit and they had no choice.
Right.
And it had to be reshaped. So to kind of get to the root of your question, the challenge that is faced today is that prior to 2020, there was a certain expectation and a certain way of working that was very venture capital based thinking, right? So leaders within companies, they had resolved into two very connected trains of thought. One was, we need to iterate many ideas to see which one is a winner. To your point, right, is a sense that, we need to just throw a lot of spaghetti on the wall, let's see what sticks.
Right.
And the second part is that we need to use what's called the fail fast model, right? And the fail fast model means that we're just going to go after a whole bunch of stuff. And then as we see that it's going off track, we're just going to terminate those opportunities, right? And just continue to iterate and move on. Because in essence, what had happened over the years is that people had asked and looked for a way to really shape an opportunity so that it could get through the execution gauntlet more effectively. And they just had not been able to find that way. So rather than trying to fix the process, they just said, look, we're gonna see what slips through the process effectively and comes out to the other side. And we're gonna go with those. And the ones that run into resistance, we're just gonna dump and run, right? When we're just gonna we're gonna just recycle. And that leadership mantra, because a lot of folks had come out of spaces where, and especially in the medical industry where there's a lot of experimentation, that, it's this hyper funding, fast to fail mindset, that, to your point, is that failure is part of the equation in terms of getting to the right answer. And the challenge that we face today is that the market doesn't accept that. We don't accept that as consumers. We are not tolerant of that as people anymore, right? Because we can see the direct impact. And our world has been turned almost permanently into a different operating model in 18 months, right? So something that would have taken 10 years to do, in a change process, it took 12, 18 months. And it has thrust people into a very uncomfortable space. And so leaders haven't adapted to that component yet. And leaders within industry need to be able to assess early on, not only is the idea in alignment with our execution capability, what do we need to correct within that context, but can we articulate what we need to do in a very clear, concise, measurable way? So as it engages into the cycle of development, we can clearly see the milestones and see how are we hitting those quality milestones, because we've articulated the need very clearly in that context. And so, the thing that really the root cause, again, because I'm sure there are people who are listening and they're like, give me some nugget that I can apply today, right? Or something. And unfortunately, the answer is also rooted in a spider web that says it's the decision-making process that initiates anything you do, right? Because by the time it gets to your desk, or theoretically your stop on the workflow, by then it's almost too late, right? When I talk to product managers about this, it's product management is almost more an exercise in damage control than it is in outcome. And by what we've seen, what our data tells us is that by eliminating a lot of those biases up front, by identifying the misalignment between capability and idea early, correcting it and engaging, you can actually deliver 50% faster at 2/3 the cost. And that's the root of it. But it has to be an integrated element within the decision-making process. And there is fear in that, because and quote unquote, you're slowing me down. You're telling me we need to go, and we'll address it as we go, right? That model no longer works. And people in leadership roles struggle, and they're like, no, we just need to go. We need to go. We need to go. It's like, no, you're going to spend a lot of time, money, and energy going nowhere. Right. Number one. Number two, you're going to defeat your employees, right? We as people want to go to work with a purpose, and we want to see positive outcomes from that purpose. If we are handed things 2, 3 times, 4 times a year that have no positive outcome, I don't know how long I would want to be associated with that entity or that leader or that decision-making process. So now that fail fast, throw stuff at the wall kind of model is not only consuming resource and time, but it's also attritioning core resources out of companies that previously maybe would have held on, but today are more in the sense it's like, I just can't do this anymore.
Right.
And so it has this constant cascading effect that at the end of the day is really embedded in the decision-making process. Maybe it can be fixed just prior to the life cycle, and having a product leader initiate that measurement or that capacity. But at the end of the day, by the time it gets to validation, if those things are not addressed, there is very little that validation can do to correct it other than trying to keep it true. And at some point, somebody up the chain is going to get too frustrated saying, why can't this get through validation? And they're going to just kill the initiative, or it's going to miss this window of opportunity. And then you repeat the cycle, and that cycle just needs to be broken.
Okay. Good to know. Yeah. I think, I was thinking about about the last 20 months and how quickly, so our industry is historically slow to adopt new technologies, new processes, new procedures, precisely for the reason, you're talking about, that there's fear. There's fear that we're going to upset the apple cart and we're no longer going to be able to produce the product to the quality, or we're going to lose control of, the process, which impacts the quality of our product. And so the answer for a long time was to just do nothing, to change nothing, right? Like, let's just keep it the same.
Yeah.
But the last 20 months, we've seen the entire industry be required to accelerate their digitalization efforts because you have remote workers, you have remote audits, you have product that still needs to come off the manufacturing line and get in people's hands, but you have all of these restrictions on who can be in the facility at any given time, and what are the new safety contamination protocols, et cetera, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it is interesting. And I think in our heavy regulated life science industry, there has been over time an increasing acceptance on the lack of focus on enabling innovation and creativity. And I know you're talking about a lot of workers wanting to be innovative, wanting to be creative, and they, in this industry, really haven't been able to.
Right.
I think up until now, the last 20 months, we've all had to be a little bit more innovative, more creative about how we're going to get our work done effectively, efficiently, and with the highest quality. So can you apply this concept of, or your concept of idea failure versus execution failure to this?
Yes.
And how does it apply to these folks who are really, for so long, they haven't been able to use their creativity, their innovation, and now, the tide is changing.
Yeah, it's a very pointed question. So thank you for that. It's, the challenge that exists right now is, again, goes into, I stumble on this a little bit only because, when I talk to senior leaders in, let's say, S&P 100 companies, S&P 50, the thing that they get very confused about, maybe that's not the best way to say it, that there is confusion in the articulation about, is the difference between an idea failure and an execution failure. And many will point out and say, look, we did, there's many case studies in terms of, where there's clarity. One example, for example, is that, Dell tried to sell high-end computers at Walmart at one point, right? And it just didn't work out, right?
Wrong audience.
And exactly, wrong audience. That was not an execution failure.
Right.
That was an idea failure.
Correct.
The execution went really well. I mean, they had product in market. They had, the kiosk looked great. The product worked great. The people right there. Everybody was just waiting for the audience to show up and buy, and they never showed up. That is an idea failure, not an execution failure. And I have this active debate with leaders who, unfortunately, are entrenched in some, old thinking that it's like, well, no, that's an execution problem. No, that was not an execution problem. That was an idea problem. The idea did not work, right? Your people executed well. And I think that the thing that happens within the space of quality and validation right now is, I think that, what can be looked at in many ways is how to really adapt to the current circumstance, because the circumstance is not going to abide. And so how are you dealing with backlog of data? How are you dealing with, processes that need to meet certain expectations or iterations, right? In people's adapting to a work culture that's partially offsite now. And, sometimes you have, because, when I talk to labs, leaders of labs, they have, challenges with, people, concerned about coming into the lab, quality concerns, safety concerns, yet they still have to run cycles that are dependent on, specific timings within cultures, or, something that has to happen within a laboratory environment that takes time. And they, and if they don't go correctly, they have to restart the cycle. And, biology takes biology time. It's not like you can accelerate it, all the time. And so the challenge goes to being able to influence specifically your process model in terms of how you do things and enhancing that from the construct of alignment of capability to the idea, even though at the point that it comes to you, and then articulating how that's going to work, but then be able to clearly feed that back into the product manager or the product leadership to be able to say, look, the reason we are having these quality issues is not because of the skill of the people before us or two steps before us. It was the fact that the decision was made to move forward on something without understanding that we had all this other work that had to be done in order to make this process successful. And that's one of the things that I think, so if I can outline it, today's people, process, and technology within any context is developed and optimized to today's need, maybe today plus one. Many of the things that we're being asked to do is a 20 to 70% aggressive shift in iteration of the business, okay? As we shift into that new working environment, that new development product environment, that means that the current people, process, and technology cannot meet that future need. That future need is all new people, process, technology. Understanding the gap between that future state and the current state is where we run into those gap in capabilities that, in essence, undermine everything that we are trying to do. And it is the missing that metric, missing that understanding and that gap of capability is the root cause as to why things don't work. And so as a result, what happens is that you're getting leaders who are saying, look, we've hired great people. We've invested in process. We've invested in technology. We're constantly at the forefront of X, Y, and Z doing what we're trying to do. And that's great for right now and today. That next idea, the next device, the next chemical product, I'll put it in that context because it's more general, that's coming down, or the next manufacturing step, right? That's going to require an entire retrenching of thinking of how our people, process, and technology are going to work. And it's simply understanding that current will not meet future if future is aggressive, right? And by aggressive, I mean more than a 20% deviation from what you are doing today.
Sure.
And that was clearly evident in 2020. All of this digital transformation work that had been going on for years, the claims of digital transformation, the digital transformation leadership, digital transformation mantra, and many companies have digital transformation offices. Suddenly we are in the throes where that stuff, that light switch needed to be turned on, and you turned it on and no light came on, right? And people came back and said, well, yeah, we did talk about that, but, actually it's really not there. And that was a very rude awakening to many, many leaders, I think.
I would think, for sure.
I would hope.
Because it was just highlighted, it was highlighted even more so because of the pandemic and because of the accelerated efforts in technologies. Yeah. And digitalization. So, and understanding the gap, as you just explained it, dig a little deeper for me on the consequences and potential impacts of this decision bias and this failure to plan for the gap, I guess, in execution for the business and for the patient.
Yeah, 100%. So let's baseline this, and I'm going to give you a piece of data that's not particularly comforting. It's that 70 to 80% of all strategic initiatives within any entity fail outright or are abandoned early, meaning that they're either terminated or the scope of what they're trying to accomplish is regressed to about 50 to 60% of what the initial expectation was, simply to get to done. And that metric hasn't changed in 30 years.
Wow.
And so until there is some true focus and understanding that the majority of what we do is not working, and we cannot find out it is not going to work in flight, once we have engaged the product cycle, we can't get 30% of the way in and say, oh, well, this isn't really going to work. We can't do that anymore because most entities cannot afford that type of failure, to be quite blunt.
Sure.
And that's at the end of the day what really needs to be reconsidered within the decision process, within the leadership process, within even the departmental process, is you cannot correct in flight. It just doesn't work. And you can say, well, my gut, my experience, and my this and my that, and that's fine when you're working on the same timeline that you had in 2019 or 2015 or 2005. The velocity of market expectation today does not allow for that correction. So to your point earlier, get it right the first time.
Right.
You have to get it right the first time because there's no second chance.
Right. So definitely. So with that thought in mind, like we can't continue on the same path that we've been for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
What can we do? What can we do in terms of measuring and acknowledging the gap in capabilities and then planning for success, as someone in life science leadership?
Yep.
I'm looking for some actionable items. Like, what can I do then? What should I be doing instead?
Yeah. Well, I think that, it's a holistic look, right? It's not as if validation or quality is going to be able to loop back to leadership and say, you need to change the entire business cycle, right? It really has to be
process or procedure. Yeah, right.
Exactly. Number one. Number two, it cannot be this opinion-based element because no one's, frankly, and the listener, I think, is very, I'm sure, worn out by this, is that no one's going to listen to you on the opinion side. It's just going to be somebody, it's just going to come across as somebody, in essence, complaining about something, right? Or trying to point out the right thing, right? How many people listening right now have been in that position in the past, that, it's the right thing, but you can't get it across, right? And so as a result, what we look at is that it's a holistic end-to-end process change with the focus on acceleration to market. Mm-hmm. And I think it has to be pinned into that context, number one. And the second part, which is very much where everybody is right now, is it needs to be data-driven. Yeah. We need to stop looking at stuff in the context of my experience and my gut and my this and my that talks about, right? It's very, people want to share their depth of capacity and saying, look, I can tell you this isn't going to work out. What you really need to drive to is, let me show you why it isn't going to work out, because here's the data that validates that. Mm. And that is the thing that will begin to turn the ship, in saying that we don't have enough data right now to make the decision to move forward. Well, no, it's like, we do not have enough data to make that decision. We need to gather that data, synthesize the data, and bring it into clear perspective in a matter of days, not weeks or months. Number one. Number two, we need to stop the gut instinct stuff or experience-based stuff, right? And it's not to invalidate that, right? What I also talk to many groups about is that, you yourself as a professional, you're a great wood chipper, right? You take in information, you discard what is not necessarily relevant, and you have refined that blade of process that the output is very efficient from the intake of information. It is not about the fact that you've experienced this project in the past or this opportunity in the past, because the one that you're doing today is not the same one you did last month or last year. It is not. There is no hybrid model of, creating this Frankenstein of best practices and trying to apply it to every situation, because the problem is that every situation, it has a different context to it. Different people working on it, different challenge ahead of you, different market expectation, different leadership.
It requires more critical thinking rather than just following the procedure or the process.
It requires more data. It requires more data to be fed back to the process and saying, look, this is where the failure points are. This is why they're happening. Or better, this is why we will not make or be able to address the need that this idea is presenting until we correct these things, right? It can be the fact that you have a shortage of subject matter capability that can contribute accurately early on. It can be the fact that you have leaders who do not know how to make good decisions or are good decision makers in the moment, right? It may be a culture problem where you have units of operating capacity who work as a collective, but are in direct conflict with the governance model associated with that initiative that you're doing. And maybe the fact that there are people involved who do not understand the deep rule sets associated with creating that product or, that drug, right? And so there are so many factors. Maybe the vision is unclear. Maybe the alignment between strategy as a company and what this opportunity is are not there. You're looking also at the capacity of the business. Right now, everybody's drowning, right? You can't hire the people that you need, yet you're piling on more work and you're asking them to continue to work at the same level, not only in their day job, but then the next opportunity element that's coming in and contributing to both in an effective way. These are the things that begin to unravel execution, right? It's not in the fact that you have an individual sitting doing a particular thing who just is incompetent. That's not the issue. The issue is that you fundamentally have so many contributing factors today to why a product cannot get to outcome, and you cannot see it just by gutting it out on the front end.
Right.
You don't have the time. It's too fast. The expectations are too high. And I'll tell you, the people who are leading are under an epic amount of pressure to perform. And if they don't, they get bounced. And so they're trying, they're using some old bias-driven models, and they need to switch to a data-driven model that clearly articulates things.
And I love that as sort of a closing thought, because as an industry, we are moving toward this big data analytics, data-driven everything, right? We're integrating more and more digital technology, AI, virtual reality, all of these things, machine learning to help us collect that data, but more so disseminate that data and make better decisions. And so I think what I hear you saying is we need to stop making decisions for the sake of making decisions, based on whatever our old experiences, but we need to instead shift to this idea of allowing our decisions to be made based on data, based on what we know and what we can assess from what's happening in real time.
So I'm going to offer you this, is that, and I'm sure that there are many who will agree with this statement who are listening, is that the answers you need to whether something is going to work or not is inside of your company right now. You know the answer, right? The thing that gaps is that there isn't a way to actively harvest and synthesize that into a metric. That's the thing that's been missing. The information is there, but it's top to bottom, side to side, right? It's not asking 5 people, right? And it's not a survey, right? It's an actual metric that you have to do through a machine learning based measurement process that leverages the harvesting of data in an effective way that targets these elements. And that's the thing that we've been focused on. And many of the things that I talked to you about in my book is that really the answers are in you as a company. You just need to leverage that data that's been well cultivated inside your business and understand how to synthesize it into an action plan. And so it's not as if there's some kind of mystery cloud of data, you need to clean the data lake and turn it into a data stream so that then you can effectively begin to synthesize this information in a way that's being done. But it's not simply in the project plan, and it's not within the product plan or within any of those elements. It's in the people within the context of the business, top to bottom. And you need to be able to ferret that out very, very fast within a few days, synthesize it, provide an answer, and then create an action plan to run corrective movement to make sure that there's full alignment to the execution process. That is when you're going to start to see downstream metrics look better. So once they get to validation, things are like clicking. And so you go from a rework rate that may be, high to medium to very low and much more manageable within the context of the timeline of you need to get to market. And so as a result, the thing that is, missing is that approach, is that embracing of that approach because of fear of slowing down. And the reality is that the inverse is, in many ways, the thing that's killing you, right? You're in flight, the idea's there, the opportunity's there. And because you have so many things that are broken in the process that you didn't fix prior to engaging the cycle, there's nothing you can do. Now you're in damage control, you're trying to contain this to some point of execution, and that's where it all unravels.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's something that we work on consistently in our industry is, really reducing our risk levels in a proactive way, as opposed to having to react constantly, because nothing good can ever come of that.
Well, right. But the addressing that is early on, not late.
Yeah. Exactly. It has to be a proactive approach, not a reactive. So, and Alex, I want to thank you for being with us today. I mean, you work with industry leaders, not just in life science, across many different industries. And so I really have had a fun time today chatting with you and hearing your perspectives from a point of leadership and a point of governance. That's beyond just what we have in the life science. So thank you for that. But before we wrap up today, I just want to see if there's any closing thoughts or action items or any last tidbits you'd like to leave with our listeners today.
I think mostly it's really about taking a step back and stripping out, that own bias-based element of, my gut tells me, my experience tells me, and beginning to really adopt into what I was mentioning earlier is that look to your data and bring your data back to the team and say, this is not a judgment of you. This is simply an indicator of the process is not meeting the expected outcome. And so that issue starts at, the time where, the water is coming out of the spring, right? Right. And so we need to take that data and work collectively to change the cultural process as much as the product process, to be saying, can we actually execute it within the context of the window we have, within the quality needs that we have, within the expectation level that we have, or is this going to become another exercise in trying to fix as we go? It's like building, what I call building and flying the plane at the same time. So it's like, we need to get out of that model, because that model will not get us there anymore. We just can't do it. Yeah. Very
well said. Yeah. Thank you again, Alex Castro, for being our guest today. Your insights and accounts on this topic are very much appreciated. It's been lovely having you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience. Yeah,
absolutely. Hey, I also want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, I'm sending out my thanks to you, our valued listeners. I appreciate your time each week, as well as your help in sharing this podcast. We love having you in our corner. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick review or an online note. We'd be happy to chat with you. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast. We'll be back again next week with another informative and timely discussion. Until then, make it a great week.